Walter Bramble and the Lantern Garden. Chapter 1. The Book That Opened. Like evening. Walter Bramble believed that every library had its own kind of silence. Some silences were stiff and dusty, like rooms where no one had laughed for years. Some were sharp and cold, making every cough sound like a crime. But the silence in Walter's library was different. It was warm, it was patient. It had room inside it for footsteps, whispers, the turning of pages, and the small, thoughtful sighs of people who had found exactly the right chair. On this particular afternoon, the silence seemed deeper than usual. Outside, the day was grey and soft. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the pavements dark and shining. The sky hung low above the rooftops, and little brown leaves moved along the gutters in tired circles. Walter had left his narrow terraced house just after lunch. He had washed his cup, folded his newspaper, buttoned his brown coat, and placed his old cap carefully on his head. Then he had stepped outside and begun the familiar 5-minute walk to the library. He liked the walk. It was not a grand walk. There were no mountains, no sea views, no sweeping avenues, just quiet streets, damp garden walls, a few bare trees, and windows glowing faintly in the afternoon gloom. But Walter had never minded ordinary things. Ordinary things, he had often thought, were only ordinary because people stopped looking at them properly. He passed the house with the green gate. He passed the little shop with the bell that rang too loudly. He passed the black cat that always sat in the same upstairs window, watching the world with serious golden eyes. At the end of the road stood the library. It was not a large building, but it had dignity. Its stone steps were worn smooth in the middle. Its brass handle had been polished by generations of hands. Above the door, faded carved letters read, "Public Library." Walter paused, as he always did. It was only for a second, just long enough to take off the outside world. Then he opened the door. The little bell above it gave a tired silver tinkle. Inside, the library smelled of paper, old wood, polish, dust, and raincoats. Walter breathed it in with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Plover, the librarian, looked up from behind the desk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bramble." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Plover. Rather a dull day." "A good day for books." Mrs. Plover nodded. "Most days are." Walter smiled, removed his cap, and tucked it beneath his arm. "Anything particular today?" she asked. "No," said Walter. "I thought I'd let the shelves decide." A sensible arrangement. Walter moved on. The library was over 100 years old and not especially grand, but Walter loved every corner of it. It had a reading table by the window, a local history shelf that smelled strongly of dust, a poetry section that leaned slightly to one side, and a children's corner with small chairs, low shelves, and a faded rug printed with stars. Walter had come here as a boy. Later he had brought classes of children here when he was a schoolteacher. Now, in retirement, he came alone. Every day he chose one book, not always the sort of book he expected. That was part of the pleasure. Some days he took down a book about birds, some days a novel, Some days a book of maps or poems or strange old recipes. Nobody seemed likely to cook again. But lately, something unusual had begun to happen. Now and then, a book seemed to choose him. It was not a voice. Walter heard no whisper from the shelves. It was more like a feeling, a gentle tug, a quiet suggestion that his hand should pause here rather than there. Today, that feeling led him past the novels, past the travel books, beyond the gardening section, and into the children's corner. Walter stopped. He had not meant to come here. The children's corner was empty. The little chairs waited neatly around the table. The starry rug looked paler than he remembered. Rain tapped lightly against the high window above the picture books. On a low shelf, partly hidden behind a row of bright modern books, Walter saw something blue. He bent carefully and drew it out. It was a large, thin book with a faded blue cloth cover. No title, no picture, no author's name. A silver ribbon was tied around it. Walter carried it to the small round table and sat down. For a moment he simply rested his hands on the cover. The book felt cool, old, quiet. Then he untied the ribbon. It slipped open without a sound. Walter lifted the cover. On the first page, written in neat dark ink, were 4 words. The Lantern Garden. Walter stared at them. Then he turned the page. At once the book opened upward. A paper gate rose from the center. Then trees unfolded behind it. Tiny flowers lifted their heads. A winding paper path curved away into a painted dusk. It was a pop-up book, but no pop-up book Walter had ever seen. The paper leaves trembled gently. The little gate stood slightly open, and then, one by one, lanterns began to glow among the paper branches. Soft amber lights. Tiny. Warm. Alive. Walter leaned closer. Beneath the paper gate, very small words had appeared. When evening folds and shadows gleam, step softly through the paper dream. The library grew quieter. The ticking clock faded. The rain on the window seemed farther away. Walter touched one finger to the paper path. It no longer felt like paper. It felt like cool stone. The lanterns brightened. The children's corner softened around him. The shelves blurred into shadow. The starry rug beneath the table deepened until it looked less like cloth and more like night itself. Walter did not feel afraid, only still, only curious, only gently cold. Then the library disappeared, and Walter Bramble found himself standing before a white garden gate at twilight. Beyond it stretched a path lined with trees, flowers, and hundreds of glowing lanterns. The sky above was neither day nor night, but a deep, soft blue. The air smelled of damp grass, jasmine, and candle wax. Somewhere nearby, water trickled over stones. Walter looked down. He was still wearing his brown coat. His scarf was still around his neck. His cap was still in his hand. "Well," he said quietly, "this is unusual." The gate opened. Walter stepped through. The garden was peaceful, not silent exactly. It had the small sounds of a sleeping world. Leaves moving, water murmuring, crickets hidden in the grass, lanterns swaying very gently, though there was no wind. The path curved beneath branches heavy with golden light. Walter walked slowly. There seemed no other proper way to walk in such a place. Soon he came to a pond. White flowers floated on its surface, and among them drifted tiny lantern boats. Each boat carried a little flame. One of the boats moved toward him. It touched the stone edge of the pond. Inside lay a folded slip of paper. Walter picked it up and opened it. The first lantern remembers the way to wonder. He read the words twice. Something stirred in him. Not quite a memory, more like the beginning of one. A warm evening long ago, a painted wooden horse, music turning in circles, a hand holding his. Walter looked up. A narrow path led away from the pond between tall blue flowers. At its entrance hung a lantern painted with a tiny golden key. "I see," said Walter. "Or at least, I begin to." He followed the path. The flowers brushed softly against his coat. Their scent was like lavender and rain. Above him, lanterns hung lower and lower, each painted with a different picture. A red kite, a wooden horse, a striped ball, a paper crown, a little brass bell. As Walter passed beneath the lantern with the wooden horse, he heard faint music. It came from ahead, soft, tinkling, like a music box in another room. The path opened into a clearing. In the center stood a small carousel. It was not large. It was the size a carousel might be in a dream. There were 4 painted horses, a swan, a fox, and a little blue boat. Lanterns hung from the striped roof, glowing like warm fruit. The carousel began to turn, slowly, round and round. Up and down went the horses. The music played. Walter stood at the edge of the clearing, and an old memory moved closer. He was a boy. It was evening. Someone was laughing. There were lights in trees. He could smell sugar and sawdust and damp grass. A woman's voice said, "One more ride, Walter, then home." Walter closed his eyes. When he opened them again, a boy was standing beside the carousel. He was about 8 years old. He wore short trousers, a knitted jumper, and scuffed shoes. In one hand he carried a paper lantern on a stick. Walter knew him, not as one knows a neighbor or an old friend. He knew him as one knows a room from childhood, changed by time, but still somehow exact. The boy was Walter, or had been. The boy looked at him gravely. "You came back late." Walter sat down slowly on a wooden bench. "Did I?" The boy nodded. "Grown-ups usually do." Walter gave a small laugh. "That sounds fair." The boy sat beside him, swinging his feet. For a while they watched the carousel. "You forgot the garden," said the boy. "I don't remember ever being here." "You remember the feeling." Walter looked at the lanterns, the painted horses, the blue evening above the trees. "Yes," he said, "I think I do." The boy held up his lantern. Painted on it was a little carousel horse. "This is the first lantern. What does it do?" "It remembers wonder." Walter considered this. "That seems a useful thing to remember." "It is," said the boy, "especially later." The music slowed. The carousel turned more gently. Walter wanted to ask the boy many things, but the questions seemed too large for the quiet clearing. The boy stood. "You have to keep walking. Will you come with me?" "Not yet." Walter felt a small sadness. The boy smiled. "You'll see me again if you don't hurry." "I am very good at not hurrying." "I know." Then the boy stepped backward between the trees. His lantern glowed once, softly, and he was gone. Walter sat alone until the carousel music faded. Then he stood and continued along the path. The garden deepened. The lanterns became larger and paler. Some floated freely above the grass. Some drifted across a still pool, reflected perfectly in the water below. At the far side of the pool stood a small wooden pavilion. Its roof curved gently at the corners, and strings of tiny lanterns hung from the eaves. Inside was a table set for tea. A teapot, 1 cup, a small plate with a honey cake. Walter smiled. Even in a magical garden, tea was apparently essential. He sat down. The tea was warm and mild. The cake tasted of honey, almond, and flowers. He ate slowly, watching the lanterns drift around the pavilion. Then one lantern floated close. It was square, made of ivory paper, and painted with an open window. As Walter looked at it, he heard rain. Not the rain outside the library. Older rain. Rain on a bedroom window. A room returned to him. A small bed. A patchwork blanket. A shelf of toy soldiers. A lamp glowing beside the door. His mother sitting on the edge of the bed reading aloud. He could not remember the story. Only her voice. Low. Steady. Safe. Walter removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes. On the table beneath his cup, a second slip of paper had appeared. The second lantern remembers the sound of being loved. Walter folded the paper carefully and placed it in his coat pocket beside the first. When he looked up, another path had opened beyond the pool. This one led through silver grass to a small orchard. At the gate hung a sign, "For those who remember half a thing." Walter smiled. "That will be me then." He entered. The orchard was still and dim. Old trees leaned over the path, their branches heavy with pale fruit that glowed faintly from within. Then he heard humming. A woman stood beneath one of the trees, tying paper lanterns onto a length of string. Walter stopped. His mother looked up. "Hello, Walter." He could not speak at first. She was younger than when he had last known her. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hair was pinned loosely at the back. Her hands moved quickly and gently as they tied each lantern in place. "You've grown," she said. Walter let out a soft, unsteady laugh. "I suppose I have." She smiled. "You always did take the long way round." Walter stepped closer. Are you real? Real enough for this garden? That is not quite an answer. It is the sort this place gives. She handed him a blank lantern. Walter held it carefully. What am I supposed to put on it? You'll know later. He looked down at the lantern. I forgot so much. His mother tied another lantern to the string. People think memories disappear. Most don't. They just become quiet. Walter looked at her hands. He remembered those hands buttoning his coat, turning pages, cutting sandwiches, smoothing blankets. I missed you, he said. I know. I still do. I know that too. The orchard seemed to breathe around them. Walter wanted to stay. He wanted to sit beneath the tree and listen to her hum. He wanted to ask everything he had not thought to ask when he was young enough to believe there would always be time. But the path beyond the orchard had begun to glow. His mother touched his cheek. You have further to go. Will I see you again? You see me whenever you are gentle with yourself. Then the lantern swayed, the leaves whispered, and she was gone. Walter stood alone beneath the glowing fruit trees. The blank lantern in his hand now had words written on it. The third lantern remembers that love does not end when the room is empty. Walter tied it to a low branch. Then he walked on. The path climbed to a hill where a vast tree stood against the twilight sky. From its branches hung hundreds of lanterns, gold, amber, white, blue, and rose. Some burned brightly, some glowed softly, some waited unlit. At the base of the tree was a wooden door. Beside it, on a small lectern, lay the blue pop-up book. Walter looked back. He could see the pond, the carousel, the pavilion, the orchard, all glowing softly behind him. Then he looked at the door. From beyond it came faint sounds. Children laughing, rain on glass, music, pages turning, the quiet breathing of the library. Walter rested his hand on the brass handle. He was tired now, but peacefully tired, as one becomes at the end of a good story when the room is warm and the night outside is harmless. He smiled. I'm ready, he whispered. Then he opened the door. Golden light spilled out, and Walter Bramble stepped through. Chapter 2. The House Beneath the Paper Moon. The golden light was warm, not bright in the harsh way of morning sunlight, nor sharp like electric lamps in modern rooms. It was softer than that, older somehow. The sort of light that belonged to reading corners, quiet kitchens, and windows glowing across dark fields. Walter stepped through the door carefully. Behind him, the great lantern tree faded into a gentle amber haze, and ahead stretched a narrow cobbled lane beneath a pale paper moon. He stopped for a moment to take everything in. The lane curved gently downhill between rows of tiny crooked houses. Their windows glowed with candlelight and lantern light, and every roof seemed slightly different from the next. One roof leaned too far to the left. Another had three chimneys crowded together like old men whispering secrets. One tiny house had a weather vane shaped like a fox. Above them all hung the moon. It looked almost folded rather than formed, like layered paper suspended in the sky. Walter breathed in slowly. The air smelled of rain-damp stone, chimney smoke, cinnamon, old books, and something sweet he could not place. Far away, somewhere beyond the rooftops, a clock struck softly. Not loudly, not importantly, just enough to remind the night that time still existed. Walter began to walk. The lane was empty, but it did not feel abandoned. Curtains shifted gently behind windows. Shadows moved across warm rooms. Somewhere nearby, someone was quietly washing dishes. Somewhere else, faint piano music drifted through an open upstairs window. Walter passed a bakery no larger than a garden shed. Its window displayed tiny iced buns dusted with sugar. Beside them stood little lantern cakes shaped like moons and stars. A handwritten sign read, "For late evening walkers." Walter smiled to himself. Further along stood a bookshop. Of course there was a bookshop. Its sign creaked gently above the door. The second page. Walter paused outside the window. Inside, shelves climbed from floor to ceiling. Small brass lamps glowed among the books. A black cat slept on the counter with one paw hanging lazily over the edge. Walter felt immediately that this was a shop one could lose an entire afternoon inside, possibly several years. But before he could decide whether to enter, a voice spoke behind him. "You're expected." Walter turned. An elderly man stood in the middle of the lane holding a lantern on a long wooden pole. He wore a dark coat with silver buttons and a soft hat with a brim curved by rain. His beard was white and neatly trimmed, and his eyes carried the calm expression of someone who had spent a great deal of time listening carefully to things. Walter noticed at once that the lantern the man carried was unlike the others. It was filled not with flame, but with tiny moving stars. "Good evening," Walter said politely. "Good evening, Mr. Bramble. You know my name." Most lanterns do. Walter accepted this answer more easily than he might once have expected. The old man nodded toward the lane ahead. "You've arrived during the quiet hours. That sounds important." "It is comfortable," said the man, "which is often better." Walter looked around. The lane did indeed feel comfortable. The entire place seemed designed for softness. Nothing hurried here. Nothing demanded attention. Even the shadows appeared patient. "I don't believe we've met," Walter said. "No," said the man, "though you have nearly remembered me several times." Walter frowned slightly. "That sounds familiar." "It usually does." The old man began walking. After a moment, Walter followed. Their footsteps echoed softly on the cobbles. "What is this place?" Walter asked. "The town beneath the garden." "Is it real?" The old man considered. "Real enough to matter." "That appears to be the answer I keep receiving." "It is a useful answer." They passed beneath strings of lanterns hung between the houses. Some lanterns were painted with stars, others with umbrellas, teacups, books, birds, and clocks. Walter noticed something strange. Every lantern seemed connected somehow to memory. Not grand historical memory, not dates and battles and speeches, smaller things, gentler things, the shape of a kitchen window at dusk, the smell of wool drying beside a fire, the sound of someone humming in another room. "You've noticed," said the old man, "the lanterns. They are made from remembered moments." Walter looked up at them again. Whose memories? Everyone's. Mostly the things people nearly lose. Walter walked in silence for a while. He thought about that. How easily small things vanished. Not entire lives, perhaps, but fragments. Tiny, shining details slipping quietly away year by year. The exact sound of a father's laugh, the pattern of rain on a childhood window, the feeling of falling asleep in the back seat of a car while adults spoke softly in front. Those things faded first, and perhaps, Walter thought, they were sometimes the things that mattered most. The lane opened into a small square. At its center stood a clock tower wrapped in ivy. Beneath it sat a tiny cafe with fogged-up windows and crooked little tables outside. Lanterns glowed beneath the awning. A sign read, "Midnight Tea Room, open for the kindly tired." Walter gave a quiet laugh. That may be the most accurate description of me anyone has ever written. The old man smiled slightly. "You are not the first to arrive here weary." Inside the cafe, several people sat quietly drinking tea. A woman in a green coat reading a thick novel. A young boy sketching lanterns in a notebook. An old sailor asleep beside the fire with a sleeping cat curled on his knee. No one seemed surprised to see Walter. In fact, everyone looked as though they had always expected him eventually. The old man led Walter to a small corner table. Almost immediately, tea appeared. Not delivered, not ordered, simply there. Walter looked at the cup. "Well," he said, "that saves time." The old man sat opposite him. For a few moments, neither spoke. The cafe clock ticked gently. Rain began outside again, soft against the windows. Finally, Walter asked, "Who are you?" The old man stirred his tea. "I keep the lanterns." "That sounds like a large responsibility." "It is mostly quiet work." Walter nodded slowly. "Are you the one who made the garden?" "No. The garden grows itself." "That sounds inconveniently mysterious." "It is." Walter sipped his tea. It tasted faintly of cinnamon and orange peel. "Why am I here?" The old man looked at him kindly. "Because you remembered how to arrive." Walter frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "You spent many years teaching stories to children." "Yes." "You taught them to imagine places they could not see." "I suppose so." "You taught them that quiet things mattered." Walter looked down into his cup. "I tried." "That is why the lanterns remembered you." The words settled gently inside him. Outside, the rain thickened. lantern light moved softly across the cafe windows. Walter realized then how deeply tired he had been before entering the library. Not physically, something else. A quieter tiredness. The sort that gathers slowly over years. Loneliness, perhaps. Not dramatic loneliness. Walter still spoke to people. Mrs. Plover, shopkeepers, neighbors, former pupils who occasionally recognized him in the street. But there was a difference between speaking and being known. And lately, Walter had begun to feel transparent in the ordinary world, as though he were gradually fading into the background of shops and pavements and waiting rooms. Yet here he felt seen. The old man seemed to understand this too. "The world forgets older people too easily," he said quietly. Walter looked up sharply. The lantern keeper smiled faintly. "But stories do not." For a moment, Walter could not speak. The cafe seemed warmer suddenly, the rain softer. "You make it sound as though stories are alive," he said eventually. "They are. That is a dangerous opinion for a librarian to hear." "You are not a librarian." "No," said Walter softly, "but I think I wanted to be." The lantern keeper leaned back slightly. "Do you know what lanterns truly are?" Walter glanced toward the glowing windows outside. "Memories?" "Not exactly." The old man lifted his strange, star-filled lantern from beside the chair. "Lanterns are remembered feelings." Walter watched the tiny stars turning inside the glass. "Moments fade," the old man continued. "Facts disappear, names blur, but feelings survive longer. Wonder, comfort, love, safety, hope, grief. They remain glowing quietly beneath everything else." Walter thought of the orchard, of his mother's hands, of the carousel music, of rain on a childhood bedroom window. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I understand." The old man nodded once. "Good. Because tonight you must choose one." Walter blinked. "One what?" "One lantern." The cafe fell oddly quiet. Even the rain seemed to soften. Walter looked around. Near the fireplace stood a tall cabinet filled with unlit lanterns. Hundreds of them. Tiny ones, large ones, round, square, narrow, painted, plain. Each completely dark. "What happens if I choose one?" "It becomes yours." Walter studied the cabinet. "And if I choose badly?" "There are very few bad lanterns," said the old man. "Only honest ones." Walter stood slowly and crossed the cafe. The cabinet doors were already open. He looked at the lanterns carefully. One showed painted snow falling over rooftops. Another carried tiny stars. One held a paper bird inside. Another seemed filled with moving rain. Walter reached toward a lantern painted with bookshelves, then paused. Further back, almost hidden behind the others, stood a simple lantern of pale blue paper. No decoration, no pictures. only a soft silver glow deep within it. Walter picked it up carefully. It felt warm. "What does this one remember?" he asked. The lantern keeper watched him for a long moment. Then he said, "Home." Walter stared at the lantern. Not a house, not bricks or furniture or walls. Something larger. The feeling of arriving somewhere safe at the end of the day. The feeling of belonging somewhere completely. Walter swallowed gently. "I think," he said, "that perhaps I have been looking for that for rather a long time." "Yes," said the lantern keeper softly. "Most people are." The blue lantern brightened slightly in Walter's hands. Outside, the rain stopped. The town beneath the paper moon grew still. Then, somewhere far away, a bell rang once. The lantern keeper stood immediately. "It is time." For what? The next turning of the page. Walter looked toward the cafe windows. The paper moon had changed. It was larger now, lower in the sky, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, something enormous was moving through the mist. Not frightening, but vast. Walter rose slowly. What happens next? The lantern keeper lifted his own lantern. The tiny stars inside it swirled faster. The deeper memories begin. The cafe lights dimmed slightly. Outside, the lanterns along the lane flickered one by one. Walter held the blue lantern close against his coat. For the first time since entering the garden, he felt a very small thread of uncertainty. The lantern keeper noticed. "That feeling," he said gently, "is simply the sound of an old door opening." Then he turned toward the cafe entrance. "Come along, Mr. Bramble." Walter followed him out beneath the glowing paper moon, and far above the rooftops, unseen but approaching slowly through the silver mist, something enormous unfolded its wings. Chapter 3. The Library of Sleeping Lights. The wings moved slowly through the mist. Walter could not see the creature clearly at first. Only vast shadows gliding behind the paper moon, silent enough to make the whole town seem to pause and listen. The lantern keeper walked steadily along the cobbled street, his star-filled lantern swaying gently at his side. Walter followed. The pale blue lantern rested warmly in his hands. Around them, the little town had grown quieter still. Curtains were being drawn across glowing windows. The bakery lamps dimmed one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played the last notes of a slow melody before falling silent. Above, the folded paper moon drifted between clouds like a lantern itself. "What is it?" Walter asked quietly. "The night archivist," said the lantern keeper. "That sounds important. It remembers what people leave behind." Walter glanced upward again. The shadow moved across the sky once more, enormous and graceful. "Is it dangerous?" "No," said the lantern keeper. "Only sad." They reached the far edge of the town, where the cobbled lane narrowed into a winding path bordered by silver grass. Ahead stood another building. At first Walter thought it was a greenhouse, then perhaps a chapel, then perhaps both. Its walls were made almost entirely of glass, though not ordinary glass. The panels shimmered faintly blue and gold as lantern light passed through them. Ivy climbed the walls, and hundreds of tiny lights glowed within. Above the entrance hung a carved wooden sign, "The Library of Sleeping Lights." Walter stopped. "I had a feeling there would be another library." "There always is," said the lantern keeper. The great shadow passed overhead again. This time Walter caught a glimpse of it between the drifting clouds. A bird, or something close to one. Its wings were vast and pale silver, feathered with moving starlight. Its eyes glowed softly like distant lanterns, and beneath its body hung thousands of tiny lights suspended on silver threads. Lanterns, sleeping lanterns. The creature circled once above the glass building, then disappeared again into the mist. Walter stared after it. "It carries them." "Yes. What are they?" The lantern keeper rested one hand lightly against the glass wall. "Forgotten kindnesses, lost comforts, half-remembered joys. Things people once loved deeply but no longer visit in their minds." Walter looked down at the blue lantern in his own hands. "And if they are forgotten completely?" The lantern keeper was silent for a moment. "Then the lights sleep." Walter did not like the sound of that. The lantern keeper pushed open the glass door. Warm air drifted out, carrying the scent of paper, lavender, tea, candle wax, and rain. Walter stepped inside. At once he felt the same strange peace he had felt in his own library. But this place was far larger. The ceiling arched high overhead like the inside of a great lantern. Thousands upon thousands of lights floated gently in the air between the shelves. Some drifted lazily like fireflies. Others rested in glass bowls or hung from branches growing indoors through the floor itself. Every shelf held books, but not ordinary books. Some were tiny enough to fit in a coat pocket. Others were enormous, bound in faded velvet or pale leather. One shelf appeared to contain books made entirely of folded paper stars. Another held glowing journals tied with ribbons. Walter turned slowly. "This place?" "Yes," said the lantern keeper softly. "It remembers." A long wooden desk stretched across the center of the hall. Behind it sat an elderly woman wearing silver spectacles on a chain. She was writing carefully in an enormous ledger with a fountain pen that glowed faintly blue at the tip. Without looking up, she said, "You are late." Walter blinked. "I'm beginning to hear that rather often." The woman smiled slightly but continued writing. "Most people are." The lantern keeper inclined his head politely toward her. "Good evening, archivist." "Good evening." Finally she looked up. Her eyes were bright and thoughtful. "So," she said to Walter, "you've started remembering?" "I think so. That can be uncomfortable. So I'm discovering." The archivist closed the ledger gently. What lantern did he choose? "Home," said the lantern keeper. The woman looked at Walter more carefully after that. "Ah," she said quietly, "that one takes people deep." Walter was not entirely certain what that meant, but before he could ask, something soft brushed against his ankle. He looked down. A small fox made entirely of folded paper sat beside his shoe. Walter stared. The fox stared back. Then it sneezed, tiny sparks. Walter laughed out loud for the first time since entering the garden. The paper fox appeared pleased by this and trotted away between the shelves. "Helpful little things," said the archivist. "They collect loose memories." "Loose memories?" "People leave them everywhere." Walter looked around the glowing hall. "How many memories are here?" The archivist considered. "Oh, millions, perhaps." Walter adjusted his spectacles. "That seems rather excessive. Human beings are surprisingly untidy creatures." The lantern keeper moved toward one of the shelves. "It is time for him to see the room." The archivist nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it is." Walter felt a small nervousness return. "What room?" Neither answered immediately. Instead, the lantern keeper lifted his star-filled lantern and began walking deeper into the library. Walter followed. The shelves seemed to rearrange themselves gently as they passed. Corridors opened where none had existed moments before. Lantern light drifted above them like sleepy planets. At last they reached a narrow wooden door beneath an archway of climbing ivy. Above the door were carved 3 words: "The Room of Almosts." Walter frowned slightly. "That sounds worrying." "It is one of the gentlest rooms," said the lantern keeper. He opened the door. Inside was a small circular chamber lined entirely with clocks. Not ticking clocks, sleeping clocks. Some stood silent on shelves. Others hung motionless on the walls. One enormous clock rested on the floor beneath a dust sheet. In the center of the room stood a single armchair beneath a hanging lantern. Walter recognized the armchair immediately. It had belonged to his father. The same worn arms, the same faded green fabric, the same little tear near the cushion seam. Walter stopped breathing for a second. "No," he whispered. The lantern keeper remained by the doorway. "This room keeps moments people nearly lost." Walter approached the chair slowly. Resting on its arm was a folded newspaper. Beside it stood a pair of spectacles. Walter touched the chair carefully. Warm, not imagined, not memory exactly, something between. A feeling rose suddenly inside him, so strong it almost hurt. Sunday afternoons, the smell of tea and pipe tobacco, rain on windows, his father turning newspaper pages, the quiet safety of being small while adults filled the room with ordinary life. Walter sat down slowly. The hanging lantern above him brightened. At once the room changed. The walls faded. And Walter found himself sitting in his childhood living room. Not perfectly. Dreams never recreate places perfectly, but closely enough. The wallpaper with tiny pale flowers, the ticking mantel clock, the weak winter sunlight. his mother in the kitchen humming quietly, and there, his father, alive, sitting opposite him in the green chair, reading the newspaper. Walter stared. His father lowered the paper slightly. "You've gone grey," he observed. Walter let out a shaky laugh. "So have you." "No," said his father mildly. "I stayed exactly where I was." Walter almost cried then, not because the moment was tragic, because it was ordinary, wonderfully, painfully ordinary. His father folded the newspaper neatly. "You've been lonely." Walter looked down. "A bit. You should have told someone. I didn't wish to trouble anybody." "That," said his father, "was always your problem." Walter smiled faintly. "Yes, I suppose it was." The room smelled of tea and old books and radiators warming slowly in winter. Walter wanted desperately to remain there, to hold on to the moment, to ask questions. But already he could feel the edges softening, like breath on glass. His father leaned forward slightly. "Walter." "Yes." "Do you know the difference between being alone and being forgotten?" Walter thought carefully. "No. One hurts, the other disappears." Walter felt those words settle deeply inside him. His father nodded toward the blue lantern Walter still carried. "You haven't been forgotten." The lantern glowed brighter. Warm blue light filled the room. Walter suddenly realized something. Every place he had visited in the garden had been connected not simply by memory, but by comfort. The carousel, the bedroom rain, the orchard, the cafe. This room, they were all places where he had once felt safe. Safe enough to become himself. Walter looked at his father. "I think I spent many years forgetting that." His father smiled gently. "Most people do." The room dimmed slightly. Walter knew the moment was ending. He felt panic rise for a second. "No, please, not yet." But then his father stood and placed one hand briefly on Walter's shoulder. It was solid, warm, real enough. "You don't have to hold on to every moment," he said quietly. "You only have to remember they happened." The room dissolved softly. The wallpaper faded. The clock vanished. The smell of tea drifted away like smoke. Walter found himself back in the circular chamber beneath the lantern. Tears rolled quietly down his face. The lantern keeper waited patiently by the door. The archivist stood silently beside one of the sleeping clocks. Neither interrupted him. After a while, Walter removed his spectacles and wiped them carefully. "I had forgotten his voice," he said. The archivist nodded. "Happens often." "I thought losing memories meant losing people." "Not entirely," she said. "Love leaves impressions deeper than memory." Walter looked around the chamber. "How many people come here?" "Very few." "Why?" The archivist smiled sadly. Most people stop noticing wonder before they grow old enough to need it again. Walter sat quietly with that thought. Then, far above the library ceiling, the night archivist cried out, a deep, echoing sound, not frightening, lonely. The lantern keeper looked upward sharply. It has found another sleeping light. The glass ceiling darkened slightly as the enormous silver bird passed overhead once more. Walter rose slowly. What happens to sleeping lights? The archivist closed her ledger. They wait. For what? For someone to remember them. Walter looked down at his blue lantern. Its glow had deepened now, richer and steadier than before, almost alive. The paper fox returned suddenly, trotting between the shelves, carrying something tiny in its mouth. It dropped the object into Walter's hand. A marble. Blue glass swirled with silver. Walter stared at it. Instantly another memory surfaced. A rainy afternoon at school, trading marbles with another boy. Laughing so hard milk came out of someone's nose. Walter laughed softly again. The fox sneezed sparks approvingly. "See," said the archivist. "Loose memory." Walter rolled the marble gently between his fingers. So, all these small things matter? "All small things matter," said the lantern keeper. The great silver bird cried out again overhead. This time the sound seemed farther away, leaving. The lantern keeper moved toward the tall library windows. Beyond them, dawn-like light had begun to gather at the edge of the sky. But it was not morning. Not exactly. Walter sensed something else instead. The end of the journey, or perhaps simply the end of this part of it. The archivist approached him, carrying a small folded paper. "For you," she said. Walter opened it carefully. Inside were written the words, "The final lantern remembers that no gentle thing is ever truly lost." Walter read the sentence several times, then folded the paper and placed it carefully beside the others in his coat pocket. The lantern keeper opened the great glass doors at the far end of the library. Beyond them stretched a narrow bridge of lantern light, disappearing into soft golden mist. "At the end of the bridge," he said, "you may return." Walter looked back at the library, at the floating lights, at the shelves, at the sleeping clocks, at the paper fox now curled asleep beside the fire. Part of him wished never to leave, but another part understood. This place was not somewhere to remain. It was somewhere to remember. Walter held the blue lantern close. "Will I come back?" The lantern keeper smiled gently. "You never truly leave." Walter stepped onto the bridge. Lanterns glowed softly beneath his feet. Halfway across, he paused and looked back one final time. The great silver bird circled high above the library dome, carrying its sleeping lights through the fading night. Then the mist folded gently around Walter Bramble. The lantern bridge vanished. And somewhere very far away, in the quiet children's corner of an old library, An elderly man slowly opened his eyes beside a blue cloth pop-up book. Rain tapped softly against the high windows. The lamps glowed warmly. The library clock ticked on. Walter sat very still. For a moment he was unsure whether he had been gone minutes or years. Then he noticed something resting beside the book. A pale blue paper lantern, no larger than his hand, warm to the touch. Walter smiled. Very carefully he lifted it, and somewhere deep inside the old library, where dust, silence, and stories lived together peacefully in the dim afternoon light, a paper fox sneezed tiny sparks in the dark.